What if I told you that spending your entire life building hospitals,
Yeah.
funding orphanages, feeding the hungry, and maintaining a flawless moral reputation might actually render you functionally useless?
Yeah, like as useless as a rotting piece of wood.
Right. Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I'm so glad you decided to join us today because we are looking at a landscape of human value that completely upends, well, pretty much every modern metric we use to measure a successful life.
It really does. It is a massive shift in perspective.
So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack a very specific, stark, and frankly striking sermon by the 18th century theologian Jonathan Edwards.
Yeah, and the title pulls absolutely no punches. It is called Wicked Men Useful in Their Destruction Only.
Which is just a staggering title.
Uh.
We want to break down this terrifying but logically rigorous binary that Edwards presents to his congregation, and by extension to you listening right now.
Because he puts forward this idea that human beings, much like a vine in a vineyard, possess only two possible destinies. You are either bearing fruit or you are burning in the fire.
There is no third option.
Right, no middle ground at all.
There is no participation trophy for just showing up on Earth and trying your best, and the extremity of that binary is what makes the text so arresting to me.
I agree. And what is so interesting is that Edwards does not start with some sweeping philosophical treatise on ethics
No, he doesn't.
or even some grand metaphysical speculation. He anchors this massive cosmic ultimatum on a single, highly specific agricultural metaphor from the Old Testament.
He goes straight to the book of Ezekiel, right?
Yes, chapter 15, verses 2 through 4. He uses that to construct a framework of absolute utility. You see, the Puritans operated on this baseline assumption that every single atom in the universe has a designated end.
Like a specific design implemented by the Creator.
Precisely. And to step outside of that design is an active rebellion against the fabric of reality itself. So Ezekiel asks this seemingly simple question about forestry and agriculture.
He says, "Son of man, what is the vine tree more than any tree, or than a branch which is among the trees of the forest?"
Right. And the prophet goes on to ask if you can take the wood of a vine to do any work, or even make a pin out of it to hang a vessel on.
And the answer, biologically speaking, is a resounding no. I am intensely eager to see how he builds this, because the physical properties of a vine create such a specific limitation.
Yeah, think about the contrast Ezekiel is drawing there.
Right, like if you look at an oak tree, or maybe a cedar of Lebanon, those trees produce timber. You cut down a mature oak, and you have material that possesses inherent structural utility.
You can actually build something with it.
Well, you can build a house. You can construct a merchant ship to cross the Atlantic. You can carve furniture that will last for generations. The wood itself has strength and rigidity.
You can rely on an oak beam to hold thousands of pounds of weight.
But a vine is biologically alienated from all of those characteristics. It is soft, it is pliable, it is inherently weak.
A vine cannot even support its own weight, let alone the weight of a roof.
Right. It has to creep along the ground in the dirt, or it has to cling to a trellis. The wood of a vine has zero utility for construction. Ezekiel makes the rather humorous point that you cannot even carve a small wooden peg out of it to hang a cup on.
Because the peg would just snap under the weight of an empty cup.
It is entirely useless.
Oh.
So taking that physical reality into the agricultural sphere, Edwards points out that this extreme physical weakness means the vine requires an astonishing amount of active, relentless care from the vine dresser.
Yeah, the contrast with the oak tree continues here, because if you plant an oak tree, you can just walk away.
Right. You come back 50 years later to harvest the timber. The oak takes care of itself.
But a vineyard demands constant intervention. You have to build a wall or fence it in to protect it from wild animals. You have to constantly dig around the roots to aerate the soil.
You have to bring in fertilizer.
Yes, and you must meticulously prune it back. You are constantly cutting off the dead growth so the energy goes to the fruit. You have to physically prop it up and tie it to supports so the grapes do not rot on the damp ground.
It is an organism of total dependency. It consumes an enormous amount of the farmer's time and energy and resources.
I think we need a modern analogy for this because we do not interact with agriculture as much today,
That is a great idea. Think about a highly specialized piece of delicate technology, like a racing drone, or maybe a specialized microchip designed for one specific cryptographic calculation.
Okay, I am tracking with you.
If you have a standard laptop, it does a bit of everything. It is like the oak tree. You can do word processing, web browsing, video editing, accounting. It has broad general utility.
It is good for a lot of different things.
Right. But a specialized cryptographic microchip does one thing. If it fails to do that one specific calculation it was built for, you are left with a piece of silicon that has no secondary use.
You cannot use it as a paperweight because it is too light.
You cannot use it to prop open a door. It is entirely useless for general tasks. If it does not do its specific job, it goes straight into the recycling bin. It is a hyper-specialized instrument.
And Edwards maps that hyperspecialization directly onto the spiritual reality of mankind, and specifically the visible church.
Humans are not designed for general utility, are they?
No, they are designed for a hyper-specific function. Rather than listing off the dozens of times the Bible uses this metaphor, let's look at the mechanics of John chapter 15.
Where Christ says, "I am the vine, ye are the branches."
Spot on. The theological argument here is that the intense, relentless cultivation the vine dresser performs is a direct mirror of divine providence. God fences his people in with laws and protections.
He fertilizes the soil with prophets, teachers, and the written word.
And he prunes through discipline. This massive expenditure of cosmic resources is directed at this weak, dependent creature.
Therefore, the inescapable conclusion Ezekiel and Edwards both draw is devastating.
It really is. If a vine consumes all that care and still does not produce grapes, it is worse than the cheapest, ugliest tree in the uncultivated forest.
Because a forest tree at least gives you crude lumber for a shed.
Right. The barren vine gives you absolutely nothing.
Which means the only logical destination for it is the fire. Ezekiel says the fire devours both ends of it and the middle is burned.
It is a brutal, sobering image that completely strips away any sense of inherent self-worth separated from purpose.
The vine doesn't get to say, well, I have lovely leaves, or I grew really long this year. If there are no grapes, the existence of the organism is a failure.
So if a vine's only value is fruit, what does bearing fruit actually mean for a human being in the grand scheme of creation?
That is the big question. And to answer that, Edwards constructs a rigid, unyielding binary regarding human existence.
He says that a human being can only be useful in one of two ways, actively or passively.
Meaning, you are either taking action to fulfill your purpose, or you are being disposed of by your creator to fulfill his purpose.
Yes. If you do nothing, and God does nothing with you, then your existence is a void. And the God of the Puritans does not permit voids in his universe. Every single particle of matter will be utilized.
So to explain what active usefulness looks like, Edwards lays out a hierarchy, a gradation of creation, tracing the flow of utility from the lowest elements all the way up to the divine.
He starts at the very bottom, right in the dirt. You have inanimate objects like soil, rocks, minerals, water.
Things with no life, no consciousness.
Right, but their designated end is to support the next level up, which is the vegetative life. The earth and water subserve the plants, giving them a physical foundation to grow in, and the raw chemical nutrients they need to survive.
Okay, so moving up the ladder, the vegetative life exists to sustain the sensitive life. The grass, the seeds, and the fruit do not exist for their own sake.
They exist to be consumed by the beasts and the birds.
Right. The cows eat the grass, the birds eat the seeds, the plants fulfill their active purpose by surrendering their energy to the animals.
And then the brute creatures labor for the rational life. They exist for mankind.
They surrender their meat for food, they give their hides and wool for clothing, they offer their physical strength to pull plows and carry burdens.
So let's trace that. The dirt transfers its utility to the plants. The plants transfer their utility to the animals. The animals transfer their utility to humans.
And mankind is sitting at the very peak of this earthly pyramid. We are the highest creation in the lower world, possessing a rational, immortal soul capable of abstract thought and moral reasoning.
So who does man answer to? Where does the energy go next?
Edwards states that the next step up from man is God himself. Therefore, man's entire business is directly with the Creator. Man was made exclusively for the glory of his Maker.
All the lower levels of creation find their fulfillment in supporting the level above them. Man, being at the absolute top of the physical chain, must direct his output upward into the spiritual realm.
That vertical transfer of glory is the highest end. Now, I can hear people listening right now pushing back on this idea, and I want to voice that objection because it is the most natural human response.
Go for it.
Someone might say, look, I might not be a religious person. I might not direct my life toward glorifying a deity, but I am a dedicated parent. I provide a safe, loving home for my family.
I volunteer at the local food bank.
I pay my taxes, I help my neighbors, I contribute to the stability and flourishing of society. People will say, I am actively doing good things on earth. Are you telling me that doesn't count as being actively useful?
It is a very fair question, and Edwards anticipates that exact objection. He counters it by drawing a sharp philosophical distinction between subordinate ends and the highest end.
Okay, break that down for us.
A subordinate end is a goal that exists only to facilitate a further greater goal. Edwards concedes that men were indeed made to be useful to one another.
So being a good parent, a helpful neighbor, and a productive citizen, those are all legitimate design functions.
Yes, but all of these horizontal relationships are strictly subordinate. There are inferior ends designed to create a stable environment so that the supreme vertical end glorifying God can be achieved.
If a society is peaceful and fed, the people have the capacity to worship.
Precisely. So if you hit the subordinate goal but miss the main goal, the whole enterprise is considered a failure. It is entirely void.
Edwards argues that a subordinate end is completely useless if the supreme end is not met. He uses several incredibly vivid analogies to make this logic inescapable, doesn't he?
He really does. Let's look at the analogy of the house. Imagine you are building a magnificent home. You dig deep into the earth and lay a really strong stone foundation.
The underpinning.
Right, the underpinning. The subordinate end of that foundation is to hold up the walls and the roof. Then you frame the house and install beautiful, expansive, clear windows.
And the subordinate end of the windows is to let in the sunlight and keep out the wind.
So the foundation is holding, the windows are shining, the individual components are executing their specific jobs flawlessly.
Yet, what is the highest end of the house? It is to provide a home for an inhabitant. It is built to be lived in.
If the house is finished but it remains completely empty forever, if no one ever walks through the door, lights a fire in the hearth, or sleeps in the bedrooms, then the entire structure was built in vain.
The strong foundation is wasted. The clear windows letting in light are wasted because there is no one inside the rooms to benefit from the illumination.
The subordinate ends function perfectly, but without the highest end, the house is a total failure.
He applies the same brutal logic to the farmer. A farmer goes out into his field, he works the dirt, he sows the seed, he uses fertilizer, he weeds the rows.
And the subordinate end of all that labor is to produce a massive, healthy crop.
Let's say he succeeds brilliantly. The wheat grows tall, golden, and heavy with grain. But the highest end of that crop is to feed the farmer and his family to sustain their lives.
If a lightning strike starts a fire that sweeps through the field the day before the harvest and burns the entire crop to ash, the farmer's labor was entirely in vain.
The crop grew. The subordinate end was met. The stalks did what stalks are supposed to do. But the highest end was thwarted, rendering the entire agricultural process a void.
The most intricate analogy he uses to demonstrate this is the clock. Think about the internal mechanics of an 18th century timepiece.
You have dozens of tiny brass wheels, gears, and pinions inside the casing.
One wheel meshes perfectly with the teeth of another. The mainspring provides constant tension. The gears turn with mathematical precision.
And the subordinate end of each individual gear is simply to turn the next gear in the sequence.
The internal mechanism is a marvel of engineering. The gears are doing exactly what they were designed to do.
But the only reason those gears were forged, cut, and assembled is to eventually move the hands on the face of the clock.
Or to strike the hammer on the bell so that a human being in the room can know what time it is.
If the motion of those perfect little gears never reaches the hands and the clock face is frozen at 12 o'clock, the clock is broken. The entire apparatus is totally in vain.
Even though the gears are helping each other inside the box.
That is such a striking, devastating parallel to human society. We are the gears. We can help each other out. We can move each other forward. We can be good neighbors, helpful citizens, and loving family members.
One gear turning another gear.
But if that horizontal motion never translates into the vertical purpose pointing to the glory of God on the face of the clock, then the entire human machine is broken.
We are just spinning in a closed box, accomplishing nothing of eternal value. If men actively bring no glory to God, they are, as to their own activity, altogether useless.
Regardless of how much they promote the benefit of their fellow gears.
This logic forces us to address another natural objection. What about historical figures, or even people operating today who clearly do not care about God, but their actions end up massively benefiting those who do?
Like an atheist scientist who invents a medical cure that saves hundreds of thousands of lives.
Yeah, Many of the people saved by that cure go on to live long, fruitful, God-honoring lives. The scientist's invention directly facilitated the bearing of spiritual fruit.
So is the scientist, therefore, bearing fruit.
Edwards introduces a vital distinction here between accidental usefulness and designed usefulness. He concedes that a wicked man might be highly serviceable to the public.
He might do things that greatly advantage good men, putting them in a position to bring forth fruit to God.
But the critical factor is intention. This serviceability was not what the wicked man aimed at. It was not his conscious design to glorify God.
Because his intention was not directed upward, he gets zero credit for the upward fruit that eventually results.
Edwards argues that whenever this happens, no thanks are due to the wicked man. He's only the occasion of the fruit, not the designing cause. The fruit that is brought forth is not his fruit.
He compares these individuals to lifeless materials, which is a profoundly humbling demotion for anyone priding themselves on their societal contributions.
He points out that a godly man needs timber and stones to build his house. He needs wool and flax to make clothes so he can stay warm while he goes to public worship.
The timber, the stones, the wool, they are all necessary and useful. They help the godly man bear fruit.
But you would never say the wood and the stones are bearing spiritual fruit. They're just dead objects being utilized by an active agent.
He points to biblical history to back this up, specifically referencing pagan kings like Cyrus and Artaxerxes.
These were rulers of massive, sprawling empires who worshipped false gods and had no personal allegiance to the God of Israel.
Yet God sovereignly used them to issue political decrees that allowed the exiled Israelites to return to Jerusalem, rebuild the city walls, and reconstruct the temple.
They were political instruments. They provided the funding, the timber, and the legal permission for worship to resume. They were tools in the hand of the Almighty.
They were acting out of geopolitical calculation, securing their borders and managing their vassal states.
Right, they were not acting out of a desire to glorify the God of the Bible. Therefore, their usefulness was purely accidental as far as their own moral ledgers were concerned.
They functioned like the timber and the stones. God used their political ambitions to achieve his supreme end, but the kings themselves were acting strictly on subordinate, earthly motives.
I have to pause here because this totally upends modern metrics for human value.
Oh, absolutely. Today, we measure a person's worth by their visible impact, their resume, their philanthropic donations, their humanitarian awards, their technological innovations.
We built statues to people who move society forward.
But Edwards steps in and invalidates all of that human achievement if the core, hidden intention is not directed upward.
He is arguing that you can eradicate a disease, you can feed an entire impoverished nation, but if your heart is not actively aligned with the Creator, your spiritual ledger is completely blank.
You are just a very helpful stone. You are a useful piece of timber. You have achieved nothing of eternal substance.
This view demands absolute internal alignment with divine will. It eradicates any reliance on superficial morality or civic virtue as a means of justifying one's existence before the Creator.
It is a terrifying standard because it bypasses the visible outcome and judges the hidden motive of the heart. If the motive is not the glory of God, the action is dead.
So, if these individuals are actively useless, if their good deeds do not count because their aims are earthbound, and they are bearing no true fruit, where do they belong in the cosmic order?
Edwards argues that an unfruitful person fundamentally does not fit anywhere in the universe. They are completely incompatible with both earth and heaven.
The lease on their existence is fundamentally broken. Let's examine the earth first. Why are they unfit to stay here?
Well, Edwards points out that the earth, despite being fallen and corrupted, is still saturated with the streams of divine goodness.
The sun continues to shine, the rain continues to fall in its season, the crops continue to grow and yield harvests.
But the earth is a temporary mixed state. It is a holding area. Edwards relies heavily on the Apostle Paul's theological framework in Romans chapter 8.
Where Paul writes that the creation was subjected to vanity, not willingly, and that the whole creation groans and travails in pain together.
The imagery Edwards uses to unpack that groaning is visceral. He looks at the physics and thermodynamics of the natural world.
He says the sun is in a constant, furious ferment, unweariedly running its course across the sky every single day,
burning massive amounts of energy to give light and warmth to man, so man can see the glory of God and survive to worship him.
And the clouds are constantly laboring, circulating millions of tons of water from the oceans, carrying it over the continental land masses, and dropping it as rain to grow food.
The animals are giving up their lives, their meat, their labor, to sustain human biology. Nature is functioning perfectly in its assigned subordinate role.
It is doing exactly what the Creator designed it to do. It is supporting the physical existence of man so man can fulfill the highest end.
But when man takes all that solar energy, all that fresh water, all that animal protein, and refuses to offer up gratitude and obedience to God, nature is deeply grieved.
The creation is forced into bondage. It has to assist a rebel against its own will.
It is like forcing a fiercely loyal soldier to carry ammunition and rations for a traitor who is actively firing on the king.
That is a great way to put it. The earth hates it. The sun resents shining on someone who uses that light to sin.
The ground resents yielding crops to fuel a body that refuses to bow. Edwards says the earth can scarcely bear wicked men for the short time they are here, and is ready to violently spew them out.
They are, in his antiquated but precise phrasing, cumberers of the ground.
They take up space, they consume massive amounts of cosmic resources, and they offer absolutely nothing in return.
Therefore, divine justice and divine wisdom demand that they cannot stay on earth forever. It would be a disparagement of God's wisdom to continually spend his bounty in vain on a barren vine.
Since the earth will eventually evict them, the natural human speculation is, why not just send everyone to heaven eventually? Why not universal reconciliation?
And Edwards systematically dismantles the idea that an unholy person could ever find peace, let alone joy, in heaven.
He breaks the incompatibility down into three distinct categories: the company, the employments, and the enjoyments.
Let's talk about the company. If we drop an unregenerate mind into the company of heaven, you don't get harmony. You get an immediate, violently repulsive reaction.
Because the original inhabitants of heaven are the angels and the glorified saints. These are beings of absolute, unblemished purity who burn with a white-hot love for God.
To place a carnal, rebellious, self-centered human into that society would create a violently disagreeable union. They have absolutely nothing in common.
The conversation, the motives, the entire frequency of existence would be alien and hostile to the unfruitful person.
Building on that relational friction, consider the employments of heaven. What do the inhabitants actually do?
They worship, they glorify God continually.
If a person found going to a 1-hour church service on earth tedious, if they found praying to be a boring chore, if they found reading the Bible to be an exhausting intellectual burden, why would they suddenly enjoy doing those exact same activities flawlessly and unceasingly for all eternity?
Planting a barren, dead tree in the heavenly paradise makes no logical sense. The soil of heaven does not magically change the nature of the wood.
It would still be barren. It would just be barren in a nicer location.
The enjoyments of heaven are the final nail in the coffin for this idea. The joys of heaven are intensely holy and spiritual.
The primary joy is beholding the unshielded glory of God.
Right. And for a mind that only finds pleasure in earthly, physical, selfish, or carnal things, the pure spiritual light of heaven would not be experienced as joy. It would be agonizing.
I think you had an analogy for this earlier.
Yes, I like to think of it this way. Imagine taking someone who physically and psychologically despises classical music.
Okay.
They hate the sound of the violin. They loathe the cello. The tempo gives them a migraine. The entire genre irritates them to their core.
Got it.
Now imagine locking them inside a grand symphony hall where the world's greatest orchestra is playing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony at full volume on a continuous loop forever.
That sounds intense.
They cannot leave the room. They cannot cover their ears. To the classical music lover, that room is absolute paradise. It is the height of aesthetic ecstasy.
But to the person who hates the music, that exact same room with the exact same orchestra playing the exact same notes is literal, inescapable torture.
Exactly. That analogy captures the psychological and theological essence of Edwards' argument perfectly. The unmediated presence of God is the music.
If you do not have a renewed heart that loves the music, being forced into the symphony hall of heaven would be unbearable.
They cannot relish it. In Edwards' words, they would entirely nauseate it. Heaven was designed as a palace for the king and a fitting reward for the righteous.
It was not designed as an asylum for unrepentant rebels. To place the wicked there would introduce chaos and confusion into God's perfect, holy order.
So we have eliminated all the options. They cannot stay on earth because the creation is groaning under their weight and will eventually vomit them out.
They are fundamentally allergic to heaven. The atmosphere would suffocate them.
They have stubbornly refused to be actively useful by bearing fruit. This brings us back to the stark, terrifying binary Ezekiel laid out.
If a creature will not be actively useful, the Creator will ensure they are passively useful. The unfruitful vine goes to the fire.
This brings us to the concept of passive usefulness in destruction. Edwards argues that just as a barren tree, dried out and dead, makes excellent fuel for a fire, an unfruitful human will be utilized in their destruction.
God is sovereign, and he will not be frustrated by his creation. He will extract his designated use out of every single creature, one way or another.
He references the Apostle Paul's letter to Timothy, where Paul talks about a great house having vessels of gold and silver meant for honor.
But also vessels of wood and earth meant for dishonor. The master of the house has a specific use for the vessels of wrath.
Edwards details 3 specific theological ways God extracts utility from the destruction of the wicked. The first method is by glorifying his justice.
We live in an era that focuses almost exclusively on the mercy and love of God to the point of ignoring his other attributes.
But Edwards reminds his listeners that vindictive justice, the righteous, proportional punishment of moral wrongdoing, is a glorious essential attribute of the divine nature.
Just as mercy seeks an object to shower with grace, justice requires an expression to demonstrate its perfection.
To support this, Edwards quotes the book of Revelation, chapter 16, where the angels actually sing praises to God specifically for his devastating judgment.
They cry out, "Thou art righteous, O Lord, because thou hast judged thus."
It is a concept that feels intensely foreign to modern sensibilities. The idea of retributive justice being something so beautiful and perfect that it prompts the angels to erupt in worship.
The second way God extracts passive utility is by glorifying his majesty and his infinite might. He brings up the historical example of Pharaoh from the book of Exodus to illustrate this mechanism.
Why did God deal so severely with the ruler of Egypt? God himself states the reason explicitly.
"For this cause have I raised thee up, for to show in thee my power, and that my name may be declared throughout all the earth."
The sheer dreadfulness of the plagues and the destruction at the Red Sea showcases the infinite magnitude of the Creator.
Think about the mechanics of human government. The majesty of an earthly king is entirely supported by the fear and enforcement of his laws.
If a king issues decrees, but those laws could be broken by the citizens with 0 consequences, the king possesses no actual majesty.
He is a figurehead. He's a joke.
The severity of the punishment must fit the infinite nature of the one who is offended. If God's laws can be flouted without a catastrophic response, then God's majesty is finite and negligible.
God's terrible, overwhelming strength is a necessary component of his glory, and the destruction of the rebel is the canvas on which that strength is displayed.
But the third way God extracts utility from the unfruitful vine is the one that forces the modern reader to really pause.
Edwards argues that the destruction of the wicked is passively useful because it directly elevates the happiness and the gratitude of the saints in heaven.
I have to stop and wrestle with this because as a modern reader, this is a staggering, intensely difficult concept to swallow.
It definitely is.
The idea that seeing someone else's punishment actively increases your own heavenly joy feels abrasive. It feels uncharitable.
It clashes violently with our sensibilities of empathy and compassion.
How can a loving saint look at a burning vine and feel joy?
It is jarring. It assaults our modern, anthropocentric view of the universe. But we have to follow Edwards's theological logic, which is structurally airtight within his scriptural framework.
He isn't inventing this out of thin air, is he?
No, he references passages like Revelation 14 and Isaiah 66, which explicitly depict the righteous witnessing the final judgment of the transgressors. The mechanics of this joy require careful explanation.
Right. Why doesn't the sight of judgment make the saints weep? Why doesn't it ruin the mood of heaven?
Because of the principle of contrast. When the saints in heaven witness the execution of divine justice, they are struck by a heavy, inescapable realization.
Which is?
They are made of the exact same biological and spiritual material as those who are perishing. By nature, they are no better.
They committed the same sins. They harbored the same internal rebellion. They broke the same laws.
They deserve the exact same outcome.
Precisely. They look at the destruction, and the thought that floods their mind is, that should be me. That is my rightful place.
The stark visual contrast of what they actually deserve versus what they freely received turns their gratitude up to an absolute maximum.
It prevents them from ever taking their salvation for granted. It produces an ecstasy of praise for the free, unmerited grace that reached down and rescued them.
So they are not rejoicing in the suffering itself. They are not sadists. They are rejoicing in the sovereign grace that made a difference between 2 identical pieces of weak, useless vine wood.
One piece of wood is mercifully pulled from the fire, the other is left in to burn. And the one pulled out sings infinitely louder because it can smell the smoke on its own bark.
The shadows in a painting make the light areas appear vastly brighter. The dark, terrifying backdrop of divine justice makes the brilliant colors of divine mercy pop with infinite clarity and depth.
That is the Puritan understanding of cosmic justice. The universe is a theater designed to display all the attributes of God, and the contrast between the vessels of mercy and the vessels of wrath achieves that display perfectly.
It is heavy. It is undeniable that he argues it with sheer scriptural force, but it is an immense weight to place on a congregation.
Which means Edwards cannot just leave it there as an abstract, academic, theological concept. Puritan sermons were never just lectures. They were surgical instruments.
He has to pivot. He has to force the listener to look in the mirror.
That pivot is the application section, often called the uses of the sermon. Having established the cosmic architecture of utility, he brings the entire massive weight of the argument down onto the shoulders of the individual sitting in the pew.
He begins the aggressive process of humiliation and self-examination.
He addresses the listener directly. He says, God will not be frustrated. He will get his glory from your existence, either actively by your obedient, fruit-bearing life, or passively from your ruin as fuel for the fire.
You get to choose the method of your utility, but you do not get to choose whether or not God is glorified by your creation.
Yeah.
The house always wins.
And then he demands that the listener evaluate their own fruit. And he sets the bar terrifyingly high, systematically ruling out everything we normally count as goodness.
He strips away all the superficial layers of civic religion. He says going to public worship simply because it is the custom of your town or your family, that is not fruit.
Praying in your house just to maintain a reputation as a religious, upstanding person. Not fruit.
Being sober, paying your debts, and avoiding scandal just to protect your business interests, not fruit.
Because none of those activities require a genuine supernatural affection for God. They are entirely self-serving.
I have to highlight a specific quote here because it leaped off the page when I was reading through the sources.
Let's hear it.
Edwards is targeting people who are highly diligent in their religious duties. They read their Bibles, they attend church, they give to the poor, but they do it purely because they are terrified of going to hell. He looks at those people and says, there is ne'er a devil in hell, but would gladly do the same.
It is a devastating psychological critique.
It shook me when I read it. He is saying you are doing all these religious chores simply because you want to avoid physical and spiritual pain.
Well, demons want to avoid pain too. If a demon could escape the fire by sitting in a pew for an hour on Sunday, they would do it in a heartbeat.
Fear of punishment is not love. Doing things to save your own skin is just another form of self-preservation.
It brings no glory to God because it is not born out of admiration for his beauty. It is born out of a desire to use God as an escape hatch.
If we push that logic further, it forces the listener to grapple with their deepest, most hidden motivations.
Have you ever in your entire life done one single thing purely out of a gracious respect, delight, and love for God himself?
Or has every prayer, every good deed, every religious observance been a calculated transaction for your own benefit?
And if you realize you haven't, if the diagnostic machine prints out a receipt that says 0 active fruit, Edwards drives home the absolute shame of that reality.
He guides the listener to reflect on the sheer scale of the investment God has made in them.
He said, look at the endowments of your nature. You are not a cow. You are not a tree. You have a rational soul.
You can look back to the beginning of time through history. You can look forward to eternity. You can contemplate the architecture of the universe.
Edwards notes that human faculties make us akin to the angels. We possess an astonishing biological and spiritual machinery capable of grasping the infinite.
Yes. You have this incredible mental architecture, and to use all of that processing power, all of that emotional depth, all of that memory and foresight, just to figure out how to eat, drink, accumulate money, and gratify physical appetites.
It is a massive, embarrassing degradation.
It makes a human being less useful than a piece of timber. An oak tree quietly and perfectly does what it was made to do.
A human, endowed with 1,000 times more capacity, actively rebels against its design and uses its angelic machinery to chase dirt.
He recounts all the means of grace provided to humans to facilitate this fruit-bearing. It is like the vine dresser spending his entire life digging about the roots.
God didn't just create humans and step back. He sent prophets. He gave us the written word, preserved through centuries of blood and fire.
Then the unthinkable investment, the incarnation of the Son of God.
The creator of the cosmos took on human flesh, stepped into the dirt, became a teacher, and laid down his life to make atonement for the sins of the branches.
He provided the sacraments, the tireless labor of ministers preaching week after week, The amount of spiritual fertilizer, blood, and care poured onto this human vine is mathematically incalculable.
And if, after all of that cosmic effort, after the death of the Son of God and the striving of the Spirit, the vine still produces nothing but wild, bitter, self-serving grapes.
The shame of that unprofitableness is overwhelming. You become a nuisance in the creation. You are a black hole consuming grace and emitting nothing.
Which leads to his final, urgent exhortation. Having broken down every defense, he pleads with the congregation to bear fruit before the axe falls.
But he adds a crucial caveat. He reminds them and us that God does not actually need our fruit. He is entirely self-sufficient.
In the book of Job, the question is asked, can a man be profitable to God? The answer is absolutely no. God is not lonely. He is not hungry.
He does not need our worship to sustain his ego.
So why demand the fruit with such severe consequences?
Because bearing fruit is entirely for your own profit and joy. God has designed the physics of the spiritual universe such that aligning with his will is the only way you will ever taste true sweetness.
You will find pleasure, peace, and fulfillment in a holy life, and God has graciously attached everlasting, unspeakable rewards to it.
He is literally commanding you to step into your own highest happiness.
He is inviting them to function according to their design, which is the only place joy exists. But he balances that gracious invitation with the grim, unalterable alternative.
If you remain unprofitable, the lease expires. You'll be cut down. He quotes Christ in John 15, describing how men gather the withered branches and cast them into the fire.
He paints this final, chilling picture of hell not just as a place of fire, but as a place of absolute sensory and spiritual deprivation.
He describes it as the place where nature finally stops laboring for you.
The sun will no longer run its unwearied course to shine light on your face. The earth will no longer grow food for you to consume.
The clouds will withhold their rain. The ministers will stop preaching to you. The Bible will be closed.
The vine dresser puts away his tools, turns his back, and walks out of the vineyard.
It is the place where God's resources stop being wasted on the unfruitful. It is the end of the line for the barren vine. The universe ceases to support the rebel.
It is a heavy, heavy document. But the logic is a masterclass in theological construction. It forces a complete ground-up reevaluation of what we consider a successful life.
It removes the comfortable middle ground we all try to live in. We want to be decent people without being devoted people.
Yeah.
Edwards eliminates that category.
He takes away the gray area entirely. You are either the house filled with light and a divine inhabitant, or you are an empty, hollow shell waiting to be torn down for firewood.
Which brings me back to the thought we started with, the diagnostic machine.
Right. If we plug our modern lives, with all our achievements, our bank accounts, our societal contributions, into Edwards' criteria, the readout is brutally clear. Active fruit or passive fuel.
So true.
So I want to leave you with a lingering question to chew on long after the audio stops today. If the entire universe, the sun burning millions of tons of hydrogen, the rain falling from the circulating clouds, the soil turning over, the historical preservation of the scriptures is laboring right now, this very second, to give you the biological and spiritual energy to make a choice. What specifically is the fruit that your life is manufacturing? Are you building something that outlasts the fire, or are you just gathering kindling? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We will catch you next time.